In many ways, I think this is the beginning. I was just at a conference talking about AI, and they said we're at the AI stage like we were when we had Nokia cell phones. Finally, everybody had a cell phone, but we didn't know what all the features and functions were. It didn't actually sort itself out yet. We're in that kind of rapid innovation space in this ambient AI, and we don't yet have the iPhone of ambient AI. We have the Nokia little brick phone of ambient AI. So I think it's yet to be determined what becomes of that.
That's Dr. Kevin Larsen, a national leader in clinical innovation and health policy, reflecting on the early, uncertain promise of ambient AI in healthcare. Welcome back to The Other Side of the Chart. I'm your host, Dr. Jill Goldenberg, and this podcast is all about the people behind the healthcare system, the patients, the clinicians, the policy leaders, and the innovators working to make care better, more human, and more effective. This show is for anyone who's ever felt lost in the system, and for those of us trying to fix it. In this second episode, we explore the evolution of medical documentation, from handwritten notes to real-time AI-generated records. In our first episode, Dahlia shared what it feels like to live deeply within the healthcare system as a patient, moments being overlooked or treated like a number, alongside very powerful examples of care that often felt deeply personal and human. Her story reminds us that our systems and our processes can either widen the distance between people or actually bring them closer together. Today we ask, can technology help us do better? Or will it reinforce what's already broken? I'm thrilled to be joined by Dr. Larsen, who's been thinking about this topic at the highest levels of policy and practice. Dr. Larsen is a national leader in clinical innovation and health policy. He's also held key leadership roles at CMS and the Office of the National Coordinator for Health IT. And throughout it all, he stayed deeply connected to the heart of patient care. Kevin, welcome to The Other Side of the Chart.
Thanks for having me here, Jill. I'm a physician, an internist, and a medical informaticist. Before my time in government, I was the chief medical information officer of a health system, where I led the transition from a paper-based charting to electronic health record. That let me think a lot about what do we like about our charts? What do we need out of our charts? What do we not like? What are the things that we want to innovate in and change as we move from paper to the electronic world? When I was in practice in a hospital-based clinic, we had gigantic charts. I would sometimes get 12 volumes of a chart for one outpatient clinic visit. That was broken, but I think we see some of the same things happening now with the electronic charts.
Yeah, thanks for that intro. Kevin, let's get started. Just for the audience, I'll tell you our roadmap today. We're going to start by talking about the evolution of the medical note. We're going to touch on this concept of OpenNotes and the transparency that's come with that. We'll also be talking about the promise of the longitudinal care plan and how to bring meaning back into the documentation that we so heavily rely on every day. So let's dive in. Kevin, do you mind helping us all understand what the note's for, maybe a little bit about what documentation was originally designed to do?
Yeah, the medical record, as we know it, was designed by the Mayo Clinic. And they also, remember, invented the group practice. So my understanding of this is when doctors started to work in teams, they needed a way to keep track of what had been done and what was happening next. And so that was the birth of the medical record in my home state of Minnesota over 100 years ago. A little story, my mother actually saved my medical record from my childhood. And my whole childhood medical record is about 5 half sheets of paper. And each visit is about 2 lines of documentation. Ear infection, right ear, penicillin was like the entirety of a visit in my records from the early 1970s. I think through time, as medical records became serving multiple masters, not just other clinicians or the memory jogger for a clinician his or herself, it started to be necessary as a legal document. It was necessary as a billing document. When I started a documentation quality program at my health system, we discovered that after a hospital discharge, there were 17 different departments looking at that medical record, each with their own set of criteria and their own set of requirements. So we went from writing a note for myself, writing a note to my peers, to writing a note for lots and lots of different audiences that I don't even really understand or know what it is they want and what it is they're looking for.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. I can imagine the different perspectives you had from all those different departments. So what do you think has changed as we've moved to paper to electronic health records. Talk to me about how the note has changed.
Yeah, as more and more documentation becomes necessary for various stakeholders to document comorbidities, to document level of care, to prove that I did all the review of systems, to make sure that if a patient sues me, that there's the appropriate documentation in the record to justify what it is that I did at the time. As all those things came, what I noticed training residents is that they then didn't edit anymore. They just put as much stuff down as possible because they were trying to avoid getting told they had done something wrong. They were trying to put as much information in the record and shotgun scattershot approach. And in fact, that's what we worked to resolve in our documentation quality program, is to say, hey, let's help you rein in, because you're actually putting more in here than you want and more in here than any of our 17 departments actually needs. So how do we rein that in? But I think we've not been very successful at that, because we have all these new tools now that will auto-generate different parts of this documentation in many different ways. And so we continue with this shotgun scattershot approach of trying to be incredibly comprehensive. And instead what we do is repeat stuff that's been in the record 5, 10, 15 different times. And we don't necessarily repeat it for any particular value other than to say, on this date, we thought about all these things so that the bill could actually only look at today's information as opposed to the bill looking at the longitudinal care that we've done.
Yeah. Do you foresee any technology solutions that exist today or are on the horizon that might help with some of this note bloat that we're seeing?
You know, the rise of this ambient technology, we have large language models that basically listen to the provider as they're doing an exam, talking to a patient, taking patient history. They then write a note. I think it's going to be really interesting to see what is the form and format of the notes that come out of that, what these designers of these ambient systems decide will end up in the final note and what doesn't end up in the final note. They're pretty impressive, and they end up looking a lot like the kinds of notes we were taught to write in our training programs. But in many ways, I think this is the beginning. I was just at a conference talking about AI, and they said we're at the AI stage like we were when we had Nokia cell phones. Finally, everybody had a cell phone, but we didn't know what all the features and functions were, and it didn't actually sort itself out yet. Yeah. We're in that kind of rapid innovation space in this ambient AI. And we don't yet have the iPhone of ambient AI. We have the Nokia little brick phone of ambient AI. So I think it's yet to be determined what becomes of that. An interesting observation I had in being part of a couple of AI programs is I saw where one AI was actually reading a doctor's note and writing a letter to a health plan. And the health plan was then using AI to read the doctor's note and to write a response back to the doctor. And your AI is talking to my AI, but actually they're creating a human readable note in the middle. So I think if we really are going to innovate, if we're really going to go beyond the Nokia brick, we're going to have to think of ways that we don't try to make everything look like the old world of paper, like a letter. There's some better way to have this communication back and forth that doesn't have as much of that kind of waste in the middle of creating something that looks familiar to us. But I don't think we're there yet. We don't know how to do that yet.
And do you think, just to press on that a bit more, do you think it's going to be these AI-backed companies that figure that out? Is it going to be government regulations? What's going to be the thing that's going to get us there?
I think it's going to be some combination. I think that the large language models have disrupted all this in such a rapid way, we don't yet know what's going to happen. So someone told me that these large language models are the fastest technology adoption ever in history. From the time they were released till now, I think there's over 1 billion users of these now. And they were, 2 or 3 years ago is when they kind of had public release.
Yeah.
So we're in such a rapid explosion of use that we don't yet know how it's going to shake out. Most governments can't regulate that fast. And so they don't quite know what to say. And in the meantime, 1 billion people are using it. So I wouldn't look to the government to have a lot of clarity for a while, because these things have to play out for a bit. And industry is rapidly evolving. On the other hand, it's also rapidly commoditizing. 2 years ago, there were a couple of companies that did this ambient listening to note generation. I heard last week there are 60 of them out there now.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I didn't know the number was that high either.
Yeah. Who knows? Again, think of the early cell phone days.
Yeah.
There were tons and tons of different things, the Motorola flip phone, the BlackBerry, all these different innovations. But we eventually settled on a form factor, which was the iPhone for all intents and purposes. And I think something like that will happen over the next years, but we don't know which one it is, and it might not be here yet.
Well, we'll have to sit back and watch. Maybe just going back a little bit to the note, who do you actually think the note is for today? Is it for you and me as physicians? Is it for the documentation specialist that's going to code to the health plan? Is it for the patient, which we'll go to next, for them to read? Who's it for?
Yeah, I think it's a fantastic question. I think it is for different people at different times. So when I would study this, and I would go out and observe. I would observe house staff, residents in hospitals. I would observe faculty. I would observe other people, like who are writing notes for whom. So in the hospital, it became clear to me that a lot of the especially younger residents were writing a note as their memory jogger of all the things they needed to know for a patient. And so other people would get frustrated that their notes were too long, but this was the single place that they could go to say, here's all the stuff I need to know about this patient. And even though they repeated it every day, that was their one place. So they were writing it for themselves, but they were being taught to write it for their teacher. They were being taught to write it for billing and other kind of coding purposes. If you go to a private practice that's all cash pay, you clear that they're writing the note for themselves. Like, this is a doctor taking notes so that when he or his partner sees the patient next, that he knows what he needs to know. And that's about it. Maybe some medical legal liability documentation, but not some of the other stuff that we're used to. Those of us that work in large integrated delivery systems with value-based care and registries and physician practice performance expectations, there's all sorts of other audiences, to my point about having 17 different departments looking at the note. There are all these other audiences that are also implicit in that note that we're writing. And sometimes even for the patient, there are many practices now that have really embraced this OpenNotes, I know that we'll get to, but where some clinicians are intentionally writing parts of the note for the patient.
Yeah, I would agree. When I was a hospitalist, I think I did exactly what you're describing. The note was so that I could document all the things I knew about the patient. It was like the best place for me to go and sort of know what's going on. And I hoped that it too captured the coding because I was so comprehensive. But I was definitely guilty of note bloat and all the things that we're discussing. Yeah, I'll be interested to see how our technology and these ambient systems and the AI really changes that. Well, yeah. So let's talk about OpenNotes. I mean, I know about this OpenNote movement, but why don't you tell the audience about OpenNotes, kind of how this came about, why it came about? I was definitely in the thick of my informatics work at a health system when we had to implement OpenNotes, which is uncomfortable for physicians initially. But yeah, tell us about it.
So I think OpenNotes is part of a whole movement to better put patients at the center of what we do. I remember a quote from the IHI, Don Berwick, that was from the patient's voice, nothing about me without me. And so how do we live out this partnership with patients, which patients want? They really want that partnership. They want that self-control. And we've moved in American healthcare from I'm telling my patients what to do to being a consultant with them and eliciting values, goals, preferences, talking through options and helping give expert advice in a consultative way. So that's really shifted the whole culture of how healthcare gets delivered. And in that partnership model, a lot of patients want to be able to really understand deeply what it is their conditions are. And I think also with the availability of information on the internet, this idea that I need to give patients just some simple terms no longer is necessary. They want the complicated medical terms so they can go Google it themselves and say, hey, what is this complicated thing that my doctor told me? And they can actually find that information on their own. The OpenNotes movement was started by some academics who said, hey, I really think it's appropriate for us to let patients see their own notes, their own records. It became much easier when we had widespread adoption of electronic health records. Back when this was on paper, yes, you could get access to your chart, but it was a lot of work. You had to often pay money. You had to go to a special department and maybe they would mail it to you. So most people didn't bother unless they needed to for a legal reason. But with these electronic health records, it was like, hey, why not make these open to patients? So a few academics started doing this in a research context to kind of prove to the country that this wasn't going to cause havoc or, make everybody go crazy. And it proved to be very popular with patients and actually not cause very much, if any, kind of extra work for providers, which providers were worried about. So from that, it became a national movement and then ultimately became a regulatory requirement that it happened. Some of the early adopters did it voluntarily, but then later it became a mandate.
Yeah.
My experience with it, what we did turn it on when I was at my health system, but it was kind of voluntary by provider because it was before the mandate.
Yeah. Yeah. You and I've talked about this separately, but yeah, I turned it on before it was a mandate as well. Actually, I had very good uptick on our patient portal because I would tell patients to sign up for the portal, read their notes, because I think it's common that patients are kind of overwhelmed when they're in front of us and they can't absorb. I mean, I know this being a patient myself, you can't absorb everything that's being told to you.
Yeah.
Being able to reflect back and read your notes, I think it's just absolutely so valuable. And it's actually everything about this whole concept of the other side of the chart. And why I'm doing this is that, putting tools in patients' hands so that they can have some agency in their care.
Yeah, we did some work about access of caregivers to the patient chart, and 25% of adults look to someone else to help them make their healthcare decisions. And so this isn't just for the individual patient to have access. It's for them to have access and then be able to grant access either by printing it out or showing the screen or having their trusted caregiver get access to the system so that your mom or your husband or your child can actually read the note also and not rely just on what you're telling them about that doctor visit.
Yeah. So when we first implemented this in my health system, I think the biggest pushback came from actually probably our breast radiologists who do lots of mammograms. And I mean, as we know, there are lots of positives on mammograms, sometimes false positives, and a lot of anxiety for those patients. And so there was a lot of just uncomfortable feelings from our physicians, especially in that part of our health system, around how patients would manage that. So tell me about your thoughts.
We had some similar issues, both with the specialties that review tests as a kind of consultative approach, so pathology, radiology, et cetera. And that's because the language they use is not definitive, right? They're never saying this is exactly a pneumonia because they don't know that pneumonia. You need to know some other things like, was there a fever and a cough, not just what am I seeing in an x-ray? So then when a patient gets that report and it's not definitive about what they have, they're not trained to interpret that report in the language in the way that we're trained as clinicians. So that causes a whole lot of spin and churn when the patient sees this thing. I've got a ground glass opacity on my x-ray. Well, that doesn't mean anything to a patient. So we had to try to think through ways, how are we going to better support that? There's a reason that's how a radiologist describes it, because it's very specific. And it is the finding that then we correlate as the treating doctor with other symptoms and signs. So to not dumb it down, but to also provide additional context was what was really important. I think for some things, we could ultimately do things like put in hyperlinks to really good medical education material. It says about this thing. And what additionally you should know as a self-serve model. So we're not going just to Dr. Google, but there is a curated, trusted source for that information. We also actually worked with these groups to modify their language sometimes so it was a little bit more approachable for a non-technical audience. We similarly had trouble with some departments that hadn't been disclosing diagnoses to their patients. I got an angry call from a mental health department that the patients were getting their notes at the time they were discharged from the clinic. And the note said this patient has schizophrenia, and the patient had been treated there for 10 years and never told they had schizophrenia. So that wasn't a problem with OpenNotes. That was a problem with how are we practicing?
Yeah. How are we communicating as physicians? I actually just had a girlfriend, unfortunately, have a positive mammogram. And before all of her path and things were back, the breast radiologist was very upfront and said, I'm concerned that we think that this is breast cancer. And I'm wondering if that would have been different before all of this transparency and availability of your records.
Yeah.
And so the radiologist was really forced to be transparent upfront. And I actually think that that was valuable as a patient to already start to sort of digest that and prepare so that when the pathology came back, she knew what was coming.
It's also valuable for those of us primary care providers. There were plenty of these reports that came back that were so filled with jargon and equivocation that we'd have to call up, hey, what did you really mean here? This paragraph doesn't describe something to me that I can actually use to make a clinical judgment.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, no, that's true too.
I meant they think they have pneumonia. That's not
Could you
what
have just said that? Right. That's a good point. Is there anything else that surprised you about how OpenNotes has changed how we work with patients and that dynamic?
Like many of these opening things up to patients, I shouldn't be surprised, but I'm continually surprised at how much resistance we have as the profession. And then once it happens, how little impact there is to the medical professionals. So much worry, so much preparatory socialization we'd have to do with doctors. And you turn it on, patients are happy, and there's almost no extra work. There's almost no extra activity. So I continue to believe in this nothing about me without me kind of mantra. How do we continue to make this a true partnership with patients and really open things up back and forth? I think the one thing that we did find, and I think most health systems struggle with this, when patients read their notes and they find an error, you don't quite know how to fix those errors in the documentation. There are pathways to edit a chart, but how do we make that happen? So an example I had, a kind of heartbreaking one, I had a patient with HIV and it was in his medical record over and over and over and over again. And we got to talking about it, and turns out he'd never had very high viral load. At one point we said, well, let's just double check. It turns out he was HIV negative and had been HIV negative for 25 years and had made all sorts of life decisions like not getting married, not having sexual partners because he believed he was HIV positive. So there's this error that just persists in his record. And you can imagine if we had been able to get back to the beginning and he had been able to see at the beginning the actual definitive truth, you could have prevented all sorts of downstream problems and life impact, right?
Yeah.
When those errors are there and the person best equipped had the most at stake, if they're not actually seeing them and helping us identify them, we're missing out. Collectively, we're missing out, and the patient especially is missing out.
Yeah. Wow. That's quite a story.
Quite revelation.
Can you help our audience understand, what do you think a good note feels like when it works? Is there such a thing?
I think it's all about what do you need the note to do? One of the things I tried to do was think of not a note, but think of the chart and think of who are the multiple people reading that part of the chart and how do I make this most useful to them? So an example of that is the consultant note that flips the note around and puts the consultant's assessment right at the very top and the consultant's recommendations at the very top. Yep, that's upside down note.
Yep.
So that's a consultant writing for their audience. The rest of the documentation is necessary, and you might look at what did they find in the physical exam, what kind of lab tests did they see. But what you really want to know as the person that referred a patient to that consultant is, what do you tell me? What's your recommendation? But for the billing audience, they don't care which order it's in. The coders have to have all the stuff there. So one of the things that we were able to do with electronic records is potentially treat those as separate chunks of the note. And for a certain audience, I'll make it an upside down note. And for another audience, it'll look just like all the rest of the notes. It's all there. I didn't, eliminate anything. It's all there. And so how to do that? Many places have started doing this problem-oriented charting where they even chart on the problem list instead of in the note so that your running history of the patient's heart failure is all listed under heart failure and all the key dates and activities that can be seen there. And so for heart failure, that's a great note. For a holistic patient care, you need some kind of integration. And ideally, that isn't just a computerized integration. Ideally, there's a human summary integration that says, with all these various factors going on, I think the most important thing for us to deal with today is the heart failure, even though 5 other things are at play. So it's variable.
Let's flip to the longitudinal care plan. Why don't you start by defining a longitudinal care plan? Because I'm not sure that everybody in this audience actually understands what that is or might have different definitions in their head and why that's so hard to do in our current electronic health records.
Yeah, so the vision of a longitudinal care plan is what are all the things that should be done for someone, especially if certain things happen. If my blood pressure goes above this, what should happen? If I fall, who should be called? If I have asthma and my asthma gets worse, what should happen next? So it's a lot of these what ifs after a certain kind of threshold is passed. Additionally, ideally, these include patients' preferences and goals. So the care plan will also say if there's a choice to avoid surgery or have surgery, I'd rather have the surgery and have it get over with rather than suffer without the surgery. And that's a kind of preference that you could put in the middle of these care plans. I actually got to lead a year-long project trying to create a longitudinal care plan for a patient-centered medical home. And what we found is there were incredibly different expectations about what a care plan meant across our health system. So in our emergency department, a care plan meant what not to do for a patient. The care plan was don't give this patient opioid pain medication. The care plan was don't admit this patient to the hospital.
Right.
And that was a very different notion of a care plan than what we would run into in the more of a kind of nursing home care or rehabilitation care, which was when it's time for this patient to eat, they need to eat only this kind of food. And if they gag, then you need to change to this. So as we tried to pile all these different parts of that care plan together, we could stitch it together electronically. But we found that it was hard for any one of these audiences to really integrate the findings of the other part of the organization because we really thought in different ways. The emergency department, when they see this care plan about like feeding someone soft food, that's not top of mind. And they don't have a way to just order soft food for that patient. Plus, they're probably not going to feed in the emergency department anyway. In an integrated health system, that becomes tricky, especially for people that are in and out of lots of departments in the hospital. I think it's still the right thing to do. It's also tricky for people that are bouncing between many different organizations because the care plan is often something that is held in a single electronic system and it doesn't port very well from one electronic system to another. There is now an electronic care plan standard in FHIR that can be used and there's tests and models for how to do that, but it's not widely adopted. There is one that has been more widely adopted, which is a longitudinal services and support plan. So this is for patients who mostly are not in the hospital and mostly not in healthcare, but receive Medicaid payments for various things like Meals on Wheels, home visits by a non-skilled provider, et cetera. And those longitudinal care plans can live at the state, usually, as part of the kind of state Medicaid infrastructure and have proven to be really effective and really helpful in coordinating all those services and supports.
Are there any other technology plays that you're aware of that are on the horizon? Any other companies that are doing really great things in this space?
One that I love is called the Swedish Rheumatology Register. So this is a shared decision-making program for people with rheumatoid arthritis that had developed in Sweden over 10 years ago. The idea is with rheumatoid arthritis, you're balancing your pain with side effects from your medicines and your function. And so you meet with your doctor, your rheumatologist, and your doctor says, here are the 3 medicines for you to take. And you can on some days not take some of them because, your side effects or whatever, but track it on this app. So here's an app that tracks my pain, it tracks my function, it tracks my side effects. And I just kind of click on the app and I say, okay, today I did take my pain medicine, but I actually felt really sleepy. Tomorrow I didn't take my pain medicine, I walked better, but I had a little more pain. So you go back into the doctor and that app is downloaded and you and the doctor now talk through, okay, here's what happened. And you jointly, again, update this. Your doctor changes your medicine some, changes your pain medicine, and then you go home and you keep doing this all the way through it as you're managing your life with your disease. And then all of the people with rheumatoid arthritis in Sweden are using this same app. So now they can also match
so
and
much
say,
data. Yeah.
There's so much data. And they say, oh, hey, we found some other people kind of like you with rheumatoid arthritis, and they seem to do well if we did it this way, right? So I think those kinds of tools, again, in this shared model of back and forth and deciding together what the parameters are, and then a fair bit of patient self-control, but with tracking and feedback is really a terrific way that these can work. It's much more dynamic. It's less, my doctor made this plan for me and I have to follow it. It's much more, here's our parameters we're going to work in.
Yeah. Well, so another area of expertise for you is clinical decision support. What's the role of clinical decision support, whether it's directed at the patient, right? Because some of what you're describing, you could actually put decision support in front of the patient, but feels like there's a huge opportunity to provide decision support to the clinician that's adjusting things for the patient. So talk to us about that.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. We're already in that place. One of the first clinical decision support technologies I built was to do this for asthma. And if you're familiar with asthma and asthma guidelines, especially in children, they get what's called an asthma action plan. And your asthma action plan as a kid says, if you have no symptoms, do this. If you are starting to wheeze and cough, but you're, feeling okay, take this next medicine. If you're really feeling bad, here's what to do. And they call it green, yellow, red. So that's decision support for a child, but it also becomes for their parent. It also becomes for their school nurse or their camp counselor, any number of people that's their action plan, their care plan for their asthma. So what we did is built also decision support for the providers to be able to say, okay, what should I put in this patient's care plan for each of these stages for them to self-manage? And that was an app, a decision support app that would go into electronic health record and say, for this kid at this age with this severity of asthma, here are the medicines that are most recommended, pick one. And then all of that would construct the patient take-home of their asthma action plan, which could either be electronic or on paper or both. So I think there's a lot of things we can do in that same space. This is a little bit like that rheumatoid arthritis case too. Hey, here's what you should do if your pain is bad. Take this. If you're too sleepy, take less pain medicine.
Yeah, thanks. Good stuff. If you had to ask our listeners kind of like a call to action and kind of what we want our leaders and tech developers to do based on kind of where we are on this journey, anything that you would say to them?
Well, if you're at a big health system, one of the big ahas for us is as physician leaders, we had kind of not jumped in to lead around documentation. We had let the rest of the organization lead us. And we found that if we became part of that team that built the strategy around documentation, things got better for everybody. So I appointed a medical director of documentation quality, and her job was to understand all these 17 departments, all the requirements, and then to create the education and the note templates for the providers that integrated all that into a more comprehensive, doctor-friendly approach. It was a big win all around. The coders loved it. The providers loved it. It rationalized what we did. So that in a big health system with all these competing factors, I would say also for providers in smaller practices, be thoughtful. Take control of this and understand what you're doing. And ideally, talk to the rest of your team members and your patients. What do they want or need out of these notes? It's easy to have them be fully doctor-centric like the old days. But you have to recognize that they are going to serve multiple purposes and multiple groups. And simple things like turning them upside down and putting your assessment on top are actually pretty easy and can even be automatically done by the computer. And it may be that the nurses answering your call line love it because suddenly they don't have to dive way down to the bottom of your note or try to figure out what it is you actually said. So, a little bit of that stakeholder input and observation. I love watching people use these notes. I love seeing what they actually read and don't read. But jump in and be part of the solution is what I would say, as opposed to admiring the problem from afar.
Yeah, I love that. That is great advice. Well, maybe right before we close, let's do one quick thing. So we're going to do a vitals check, which is kind of the fun kind. We're going to check your non-clinical pulse. You ready?
Right. Yep.
All right. So now we're going back to when you were, seeing patients. Did you have like a certain comfort food that you liked after a long shift or a long work day?
I eat everything. And as a resident, I would usually have 2 or 3 lunches at a time. It was hard to say that there was a favorite. For a while, we could get jelly beans out of the hospital cafeteria. So many of us would walk around with like jelly beans in our lab coat pockets that we could grab when we needed a little extra sugar.
I love that. All right. Is there a book that you can think of that maybe has changed the way you've thought about care delivery? Is there anything that comes to mind?
Yeah, the book from Virginia Mason about transforming to patient-centered care. I think that's the title. It's by Kenney, Kenney. And it's this hospital system that realized they weren't very patient-centric and set about a multi-year course of really, really turning that around. It's very fascinating. Like one of the ahas, they used this lean methodology, and they had some people from Toyota come over, and they were showing them their hospital blueprints. And the Toyota people pointed, what's this big room here? And they said, well, that's our waiting room. And they said, well, who waits there? And they said, our patients wait there. Well, doesn't that embarrass you that you make your patients wait? It's filled with little nuggets like that about how to totally rethink about what we do and how we do it.
Yeah. That's awesome. Well, Kevin, this has been so fun. You are so knowledgeable with your years of experience in all of these different settings. So really appreciate your time. I can't wait to hear feedback from our audience. And thank you for joining me for the other side of the chart.
Thank you. Take care.
Thanks, Kevin. Okay, that's a wrap on today's conversation. And I hope it gave you new perspective on something so foundational, yet so often overlooked, the medical note. What we document and how we document shapes not just things like reimbursement, but the way we communicate, the way we connect, and ultimately the way we care. Whether it's a resident writing for memory, a patient reading to understand, or a system that's coding to measure, the note lives at the center of it all. So, to all the builders of process and technology out there, let's build a better widget. One that tells the right story, supports real understanding, and keeps the person, not the problem, at the center. Huge thank you to Dr. Kevin Larsen for sharing his insight, his stories, and his decades of experience across the public and private sectors. From OpenNotes to longitudinal care plans to jelly beans and lab pockets, you brought both clarity and heart to this conversation. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd love you to share it with a colleague or leave a quick review. Thanks for listening. This is The Other Side of the Chart. Stories and insights for those building the future of healthcare from the inside out. We'll see you next time for episode 3, when we'll shift from talking about technology and documentation to care models, specifically palliative care, hospice, and medical aid in dying. I sit down with Dr. Barbara Morris to explore a part of medicine that exemplifies what person-centered care should look like. The Other Side of the Chart is a production of G-Berg Productions, produced and hosted by Dr. Jill Goldenberg. Sound editing by Anthony Rotolo. Music by Relaxing Motivational Corporate by Fretbound. From Free Music Archive, licensed under Creative Commons Attribution 4.0.